Hello, everyone. My name is Corey Whitney, as you know, and I will be speaking to you now about sustainable development goals in the relationship to horticulture and offer you some kind of theory of change to set you up for the work we're going to be doing together in the rest of this little part of the lecture. In this little set of slides, we'll be talking about, or in this little lecture here, we'll be talking about some of the challenges related to horticulture and sustainable development, and also some of the visions just to inspire your thoughts for the group work that we'll be doing in the coming days, visions for horticulture, and we'll set you up for interaction and work within the rest of this lecture on horticulture and the SDGs. So we're going to be talking about some major sustainability challenges, global challenges, and just to sort of put it all in perspective, this is a photo taken in the 70s by NASA astronauts. I may have shown this photo to you before. The idea, the interesting thing about this photo in the 70s is that it really gave a new life to the environmental movement because it allowed us to see sort of for the first time how finite we really are in the universe, flying on this little blue marble through space. And it allowed us to see really, or put into perspective the effects that we're having on the environment, the major role that humans have on the loss of biodiversity and changing of the conditions on this marble. The population has since more than doubled. This is what we're calling a demographic threat. So according to the United Nations, we can expect a population increase to nearly 10 billion by 2050. This is from the Gapminder, by the way. I'm sure I've plugged it before, but if you haven't seen anything from the Gapminder before, it's worth checking out gapminder.com. Bubble size here is population, and these are expected increases by 2050. So how will all these people get access to adequate nutrition? And this, of course, is more complex than a proportional increase in the demand for food. This population growth has been part of the major changes to the ecosystem and led to major losses in biodiversity. Not really population growth so much as the growth in need for stuff, and especially food. Red zones here represent losses of more than 40% compared to an intact ecosystem. And there's been a major, and we're expecting more of this, a major effect of climate change on food production. Those people need food. Much of the biodiversity loss was to produce food, and now we're expecting to see major losses in many regions of our ability to produce food. This is an optimistic view according to Klein, but those green zones are gains of around 25%, and the orangey red zones are losses of around 25%. There are some benefits in some regions, but mostly in many important regions, major losses in Central and South America, Africa, and parts of Asia. So the big challenge here, how do we adequately nourish a growing population in times of climate change and loss of biodiversity? Well, let me just to put it, first of all, just a simple way to think about sustainability. This is sort of the basic Venn diagram of sustainability. We have ecological conditions, social and economic conditions. If these are all balanced for any system, then that represents sustainability. What we're interested in, or at least here in this question of horticulture and horticulture research, we're talking about our relationship, or the relationship of us as researchers between looking at horticulture and its implications on cropping systems, on our ability to produce food and maintain agroecosystems in a sustainable way. So this is just a simple Venn to help us think about what is sustainability really. And a much more complex diagram here, we have the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and these represent a much more dynamic and holistic approach to thinking about what is sustainability, what does it include, and of course it includes these 17 things, which you'll note immediately from the diagram what each of these things are. You'll probably have a good overview of that. But essentially we've generated these 17 goals, and the thing that we hope to do here, I think as a global community, is to try to address those sustainability issues and to try to create a sustainable future and to understand what that is. We've put together these 17 ideas. They represent our collective vision for a sustainable future. And of course, it's much more complex than that standard ecological, economic, and social pillars of sustainability. This was established in 2015, and it should be achieved by 2030 is the idea, these SDGs. What else do I want to say there? This is from the Stockholm Resilience Center, and it represents the biosphere foundation for the SDGs. So these are the same 17 SDGs, but with the biosphere here at the base holding up the rest. And this really shows the importance of life on land and in water, clean water and sanitation, and climate action. And food is really linked right across all of the SDGs. People need to eat. Food comes from production systems that affect natural systems. So we really need to find ways to have sustainable food production if we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And unsustainable agricultural production is part of the problem, but it can also be, agricultural production can also help to solve the problem. And horticulture may be part of the way that we address these global issues with agriculture. There's this diagram here from Scown and other authors. So just to anchor you a little bit on thinking about interactions, synergies, and trade-offs for your own work. This is in particular in relationship to EU agricultural policy, but they basically talked about how, in the Scown paper, if you look at that, they talk about how we can't really try to address goals individually. We can't think about SDGs as individual, but we must think about them as an entire group. And I've put here just a way of thinking about how these are all interacting by drawing up a little diagram of the interactions between the different SDGs. So there's a common understanding. What should really sustainability and sustainable production be? But there's a question about how to achieve that. And there are some different possible pathways. And it comes down to really an argument between intensification versus extensification. So on the one hand, you have on this one of the diverging pathways, you have the idea that we can produce more on less land, so higher productivity. And on the other hand, you have the idea that we can produce more biologically, more agrobiodiversity rich and closer to nature, but on more land is the argument. So that's the land sharing and the land sparing idea. So the idea is that in land sharing, we produce in this agroecological way so that food can be shared, so that food production areas can be shared with natural ecosystems. And then the land sparing idea, we produce super high intensity industrial agricultural production on smaller parcels of land and leave the rest to nature. But there are a number of studies that confound these dichotomous arguments, so it's maybe not so black and white. So what we know actually is that sustainability is not a competition between high-tech industrial and small farms, but a collaboration to achieve common goals. And there have been quite a few studies in many countries that show that smaller farms had higher yields. So this can confound some of those arguments about intensification and sparing and sharing, or intensification and extensification. And these smaller farms, there are also some studies that showed no clear relationship and no clear relationships to resource efficiency, GHG emissions, or profits. And there's some suggestion actually that the technologies we might need may already be ready or having some issues being implemented. For example, integrated pest management, agroforestry, microirrigation. You've been working on agroforestry questions, so you're familiar with that. These can have win-win outcomes for improved agriculture and environmental implications of their production system. So horticulture may be part of the solution, in particular agroforestry. So we'll revisit the work that you've done on agroforestry to think more about that. And now I'm going to talk about a few just specific visions, just to give you some ideas about what different possible pathways there are toward future agricultural or horticultural or sustainability in horticulture. But the main take home will really just be, I'm just going to give you two studies, but the main take home will be that there's not really a silver bullet, and we should choose the best options for the right settings. And these can be customized to farmers' settings. That's why you've worked on your own projects on this. So there's no real panacea. We can pick and choose among options that are suitable and customized for farmers and conditions. So sustainability challenges, possible pathways. Let's talk first about urban farming. So some studies in the UK show that there is enough space to grow the food in the urban environment and to feed citizens. Mostly right now it's not food security relevant, and there's some potential issues with contamination to be considered. The production systems are not really about income generation in most urban areas. There's not that much money being made. There's not really there's something more than just food security. There's some kind of multifunctionality benefits where people get involved. They have community development. There's social cohesion, so there's a benefit there potentially. And there are studies that show some potential climate benefits. Increased water infiltration, limiting of impacts from storms, reducing emissions from transportation and from those transportation costs, actually, and contributing to cleaner air potentially within the urban environment. But of course, urban land is extremely expensive, and we could make a business case for other uses for this land. There are people who need apartments, there are people who need places to live, and the relatively minor cost of transporting some vegetables from a plot of land just in the peri-urban region in order to provide an apartment for someone inside the city who needs a home could be pretty hard to argue against. Another thing that people often think about is vertical farming. So to try to produce horticultural production in these rather stacked forms. It's a nice potential solution for land sharing versus land sparing, of course, because you have a pretty highly increased yield per unit area, theoretically. There should be many of the same benefits as urban farming and covered farming. Shorter supply chains, good conditions for perishable foods, potentially. But we're not really there yet. The cost of the architecture is rather high compared to land. As you can imagine, it's a really expensive way to harvest, using climbing around to harvest and using lifts and things. But all the different methods for producing this stuff, it's an extremely high resource use. If we think about per unit energy, they really likely, there's no way for this kind of vertical farming in its current form to compete at all with other forms of horticultural production. So now on to the big main take-homes. These are this is a map actually just almost identical to the one I showed earlier, but this one actually comes from Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And what I want to plot on top of this, because this is where I got this, from Goparaju and team, you're going to read this paper. They talk about the strengths of agroforestry production. So we'll take that as one kind of case study horticultural production system. They talk about the strengths of agroforestry production systems in addressing these different SDGs. And I think this gives us a nice link into thinking about the synergies and trade-offs and maybe the strengths of different types of horticultural production systems for addressing specific SDGs. So what have we learned here? To recap, you learned about some of the big challenges and also some of the visions of horticulture, just very briefly, just a few little highlights. And against this backdrop, we're going to focus on horticultural production and the SDGs in the next lectures, or in the next parts of this lecture. So we'll see you on Wednesday. And thank you very much.